Let's talk about all the books I read in the month of January. I read a total of 9 books this past month, and I did make the effort to write out all of my reviews except for one book beforehand and post them on Goodreads. So hopefully this wrap-up video will go a little bit shorter. I might film it over the course of 2 days because I am losing light. But if you're interested, stick around and we will get right into this video. The first book I finished was Sabrina and Corina by Fajardo-Anstine. This is a collection of short stories that centers on the lives of primarily working class Latinas living in Colorado and the American Southwest. And each story is focused on adolescent girls and young women who are struggling to gain a foothold in a world of intergenerational violence and trauma. The writing really does, at times, it really made me feel sometimes the way Toni Morrison's writing can make me feel, although I think it is a little bit more vague, and I think that is primarily because this was a collection of short stories, so I didn't really get the sense of getting super close to any of the characters in the way I would with a novel. It is still beautifully written nonetheless, but it is singularly devastating. There was something deeply sad about this collection, and unfortunately though, I didn't really relate to any of the stories on a personal, visceral level. And I think that is because, like I said, something about this collection, the way it was written, the characters are kind of held at a distance from the reader. This collection is billed as being about Latinas of indigenous ancestry, and I don't think that's really accurate. Like, yes, indigenous ancestry of most Latinos is acknowledged in this collection, but it isn't actually about indigenous people from Latin America who have still retained their culture and tribal characteristics living in the US, right? This is sort of an acknowledgement of that mixed race ancestry, but it doesn't really delve deeper than that. There is a book that talks about this a little bit more, and that sort of longing to connect with that indigenous past, which I read last year, is Catalina by Karla Cornejo Villavicencio. There is a story, one of the stories does have a Latina character who has a Navajo boyfriend, and he goes off to the Navajo reservation for a while, and you sort of see flashbacks interspersed of their relationship, and the story involves the Navajo creation myth. But other than that, and like I said, the acknowledgement of indigenous ancestry, I don't really think this is accurately billed. And so I don't think there's like a single bad story in this collection, but I don't know if there was any single story that just like really stood out to me. I mean, the only one I think I can think of was Tommy. The story is called Tommy, and it's about a formerly imprisoned woman who comes back to live with her brother and nephew, and her nephew is like just addicted to video games, and she tries to get him to like get out of the house more and like go to the library, and it's rather insulting to her. He's like, you were a fat goth chick, weren't you? And there were sort of like funny moments in it, but yeah, I mean, I thought it was decent. I ended up rating this, I'd say 3.5 stars, and I ran it up to 4 stars, but I think there was maybe a bit of like a sameness to this collection that none of the stories like particularly deeply stuck with me. The next book I read was Luster by Reva and Leilani. This firmly takes its place in one of those disaster girl, millennial, sad girl novels, but it follows a little bit untypical for the genre, an African-American woman who is living in New York roughly takes place in the late 2010s, and she is a visual artist, and she has a dead-end, underpaid job working in trade publishing, and she ends up getting involved with this much older married man and she becomes drawn into their open relationship, but it's not really open in the way, at least because she ends up having this sort of weird relationship with his wife as well. And they also have an adopted black daughter. The couple is white. So that adds another layer of this weird awkwardness to it. I enjoyed this overall, but there were times it made me so comfortable because her name is Eddie, the main character. Or Edie, maybe. At times you're just like, girl, what are you doing? Because she's so self-destructive and just sort of lays herself at the hands of this self-absorbed older married man who just really wants to have his cake and eat it too. And like the power dynamics of their relationship, even like the sexual politics they were rather uncomfortable to read. It did remind me of a little bit of Meg Nolan's Acts of Desperation. The writing itself it's rather interesting because the writing, I think, will not be everyone's cup of tea. It's at times almost poetic. It has these very lengthy run-on sentences that can take a bit to get used to. I mean, I personally didn't mind it. But I can understand that it won't be everyone's cup of tea. And I think where this novel ends up really shining is that there were a lot of really poignant observations about the realities of being African American and specifically being a Black woman living in America. And I think that these were the strongest sections of the novel. The story does have this sort of dreamlike quality, I think, in the way it unfolds. And there are so many like observations and actions that are going on that sometimes you have to slow down your reading because you're like, wait, what happened here? And I do think, though, my only criticism is that I think that at times I had to kind of suspend my disbelief. The way in which the author writes about trade publishing in New York City in the 2010s and everyone's sleeping with everyone and people are having sex in the office. As someone who worked in trade publishing in the exact same era, I can tell you this is not reality. I don't know where she was getting this, if she was sort of superimposing a different era or industry onto this one, but it just wasn't accurate. I was like, okay, that would not happen. But overall, I still really enjoyed this. I think I read it in like a day over the weekend, and I think it's a really good, memorable coming of age story, however uncomfortable it can make you feel about coming of age in the cutthroat world of late stage capitalism. So I rated it 4 stars. The next book I read was Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë, doing some classics here. I did finally read this because of the movie adaptation, which I think was released in theaters here in the US yesterday, as of the day after I'm filming this. I liked it, I think, for a classic text from the 19th century. I have said in my last wrap-up when I reviewed The Age of Innocence, which was published in 1920 but has a 19th century cadence, that I was just not a fan of 19th century writing. And that is generally true. I mean, there are a few exceptions, like The Picture of Dorian Gray. But this one, it was a little better than what I expected. But I think that it did drag in the second half. So the story, the plot, if you're not aware, it has this sort of like narrative within a narrative within a narrative. It follows, we start out from the perspective or narrative of this man named Lockwood, and he is a tenant on this estate, and his landlord is this man named Heathcliff, who he was adopted by this white English family. He is Romani. He's not outwardly said to be Romani, but like, there's always this big hullabaloo still about, oh, what is Heathcliff? Maybe he's just a swarthy white person. Maybe he's Black. He's clearly Romani, okay? And Heathcliff is just overall a despicable human being. And so Lockwood ends up going over to one night this sort of like neighboring estate, and he ends up striking this very long conversation with the housemaid Nellie. And Nellie begins to tell the tale as to because Lockwood senses there's a really weird dynamic in this house with Heathcliff and his relationship to the young people in the house. And so Nellie begins to tell this tale of like how all of this played out. And, you know, I can't even really get into it because it is, like I said, there's sort of like a narrative within a narrative. And that I think is what gets a little confusing about it, because at times, sometimes there is one of the characters, I think her name is Isabel. She is telling the story to Nellie, who is telling the story to Lockwood. So there are 2 volumes in this, and Kaveh, who is Heathcliff's love interest, if you want to read this and you don't know the story, you can skip ahead. Kaveh dies midway through the novel, and so in volume 2, we then follow Kaveh Jr., essentially, her daughter. And so my understanding is that there has never been a single film adaptation that has adapted volume 2. It is only focused on volume 1. This is not a love story. I mean, it is about a toxic, lusty, never quite consummated love, you could say, but it is primarily about revenge and a man who is having his revenge out on this family and then continues that revenge through the heirs. And it obviously really plays into this whole European stereotype of the gypsy curse, so to speak. I think it is an interesting tale, and the one thing I will say is that for a 19th century novel, I think it had pretty decent pacing, because that has been my issue with novels from this time period, is it takes a while. It's just like, get to the point. But this kind of does the opposite, and that the first half is interesting, and then because I think you sort of start this novel at a point in time where much of what happens in the first volume has already transpired. By the time you get to the second half and you're caught up, you're like, okay, I kind of know what's gonna happen now. So that's where I started to lose interest a little bit. I thought it was fine. I rated it 3.5 stars. Like I said, I like it more, I think, than Jane Eyre, her sister's most famous novel. But I read Jane Eyre my senior year of high school, so that's probably not a good representation. But yeah, I would recommend checking it out. I would recommend reading it if you haven't, because from what I've heard about the latest film adaptation, it does not do it justice at all. So I will see, because I do plan on seeing it at some point. The next book I read was If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English by Noor Naga. This slim novel follows an unnamed Egyptian American woman who travels to her parents' homeland for 6 months to teach English at the British Council. And this is post-Arab Spring. So again, sometime in like the late 2010s. And she unwisely becomes involved with a photojournalist who lives there, a very poor, disillusioned man from a small town who has a drug addiction. And he took part in the protest and resistance during the Arab Spring in 2011. And the Arab Spring, which turned into the Arab Winter for most countries except for maybe Tunisia, he is now severely disillusioned at how things have turned out, in some cases for the worse, post the Arab Spring. And so he wanders the streets, subsiding on his drug addiction, and they become unwisely involved. So this novel is, or novella you could say, it's split into 3 parts. And the first part is each chapter begins with like a rhetorical question, and then it shifts back and forth between the woman's point of view and the man's point of view, which when you're first reading this is not actually clear. And then the second chapter or second section continues with this POV switch, but it removes the questions and adds footnotes as to like a bit of a historical or cultural context. And then the third section is this meta section, which I'll discuss later. This I did not really like. So I actually liked this, and there were certain things personally that did resonate with me in a way, and one of them was sort of like the diasporic aspect of it and this interrogation of what does it mean to be descended from people within the global south, to be a sort of racialized other when you're living in the imperial core, and then that culture shock as identity shifts when you actually travel and live in that country, and how you go from feeling like the other in your own country to immediately feeling very American, very westernized when you travel to the global south or to your parents or grandparents or whoever's home country. And that sort of that acknowledgement of like that shifting, like these shifting categories of power and privilege and passing as native, even when you like can barely or don't speak the country's language at all. I mean, there was a lot, like I could relate to that as someone who has formerly traveled a decent amount and oftentimes gets mistaken for being a native of certain countries, whether or territories, whether it is Morocco or Puerto Rico, and people thinking that I speak fluent Arabic or Spanish. And I think sort of it also touches on too, on like feeling like you've, like I've kind of won something, but it's like, well, what did you win? Like at the end of the day, you are fully westernized, you are an American, and whatever perhaps difficulties you may or your parents or grandparents may have had as the other, as a diasporic person, it doesn't even really compare to what the people living in that country are going through. Because there's just a level of poverty and brutality that I think those of us who live in America can't even really, most of us, we just can't even really fathom. And so the book does grapple with a lot of these really heavy topics. It doesn't provide answers though, and so if you're looking for answers, you probably will be disappointed. I don't love how they call this a dark romance. I don't think that was the author's intention because, I mean, first of all, the relationship between the main character and this man, there's nothing romantic about it. There's nothing even sexy. They don't have chemistry. I think they're both just supposed to be stand-ins for someone who is very privileged from the West, and then a man who is like very downtrodden and from the global South. And so that dynamic uncomfortably shifts because he is also very abusive and very misogynistic and is extremely possessive. And so all of this ends up really culminating in something. Now, the thing that I did not like was an aspect of this novel that is very, very popular right now within writing, and that is the meta aspect. I have especially noticed this in diasporic novels. Endling by Reva and Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. But it's not even that. It's just in general, the meta aspect is so popular in writing in this decade, and I used to not mind it. I used to kind of like it, and now I'm getting sick of it because it just is a way, I think, for writers to kind of like preemptively wave away criticism, and it doesn't work because people like stand on your work, just stand on your work. Not everyone is going to like your work. Not everyone is going to get your work. That's the whole point of art. It has multiple interpretations. I just don't want to read again about another creative writing workshop or your struggles as being a writer. I understand, I have been in that world as someone who was in publishing, who was in an MFA program. Like, it's not foreign to me, and I frankly don't care to read about it. So that was the only thing that I just didn't like about this. But overall, I do think that it did raise a lot of important questions. There were aspects I could relate to. I thought it was a compelling story, and yeah, I would rate it 4 stars. The next book I finished in January was The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. So this deals with it is like a retelling or a spin on a Native American folk tale of the elk woman or the deer woman, I think. The story follows these 4 Native American men who when they were young, they crept onto this part of the reservation where they didn't belong, and they slaughtered a bunch of elk. And so one of the elk had a baby that was killed, and so that baby, or the mother actually, comes back as an elk woman to haunt them and enact her revenge. Now, I personally did not like this as much as the Buffalo Hunter. I think for a variety of reasons. The first was that the horror in this is very slasher-like, and while I think that the Buffalo Hunter, like both this and the Buffalo Hunter are equally very bloody, gory books, I think that the way that the horror is written in this is, like I said, it has almost more of a cartoon-like aspect. I don't quite know how to articulate that. The first half, I think it gets better as it goes along. So you follow sort of like each of these four men as the elk woman is coming for them. The book does portray life on the reservation, specifically Blackfoot Native people, which is what Stephen Graham Jones is. This book does deal with like intergenerational trauma and revenge and separation from one's culture due to ethnic cleansing, and so you can sort of see how certain people within the book are still trying to keep that culture alive, still, in the face of 500 years of ethnic cleansing and genocide. I think another reason, though, why I didn't love this as much as the Buffalo Hunter, besides the way the gore aspect was written, was sometimes I don't know if the characters, like, their actions really matched up. Like, the first guy we follow, Lewis, he has this real sort of, like, descent into madness that just felt like it kind of came out of nowhere. And then another one of the men, we follow his daughter a lot because she's in high school and she's a basketball player. Basketball is like a huge theme, a huge aspect of this book as well, and so there's a lot of detailed depictions of that within this story that, as someone who doesn't know a lot about basketball and doesn't care about sports in general, I think my eyes started to glaze over. I think that there's a lot of like important aspects to this book, just as like contemporary life on the reservation and a lot of like the themes it touches on, but I was like less interested in just certain aspects that play an equally important weight in this book, like the basketball aspect, like the horror supernatural aspects when they happened, because they were just so gruesome. There's also a lot of, again, animal death, not just of elk, but of dogs. Like, there's a lot of domestic dogs, and that was hard for me to read. Especially because one of the dogs in the beginning is a Malamute named Harley. I have a Samoyed named Harley, so that I just was like, oof. And I know that makes me sound like a hypocrite because I get more upset about domestic animal death than wild animals, but yeah, this was not really an easy read. Like I said, I think there's aspects of it that are important, but yeah, overall, I just think was really like the way the horror was written, the slasher-esque horror, it just wasn't my cup of tea, so I rated it 3 stars. The next book I read in January was Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. I had mentioned wanting to read this book at the end of last year, and I had actually did a soft DNF because when I started rereading it a couple months ago, I was too tired. I was like, this is a little too complex for me, so I saved it for later, and I am so glad I did. So I read this originally back in college, and I didn't really remember much of the plot. I did remember a couple key lines, though, in this book, which is funny. It's essentially like a coming-of-age story of a young African-American man who is nicknamed Milkman. Milkman Dead is his name. And he comes into his own because throughout, like, the first half of this story, he's kind of just someone who wanders through life without a purpose, and he just sort of goes along with the flow. His maternal grandfather was actually a doctor. So he was a black man who was able to become a doctor. And so the family they live a sort of middle-class life, which is very rare for black people in that time period. And this takes place in the Michigan area, somewhere in Michigan. And then his father, Macon Sr., is like a real estate agent. Or just a real estate guy. He has a family business. He is a landlord. And so Milkman kind of thinks, well, I guess like, yeah, I'm just going to like take over the family business. As Milkman is coming of age, he has this best friend named Guitar. And Guitar is very politically aware and involved and ends up joining this vigilante group that Milkman is like, what are you doing? Like, you're crazy for doing this. And Guitar sort of points out, well, like, you don't do anything. Like, you don't care about anything. Like, there's all of this horror that's happening around us, happening to black people, and you're just sort of like going along with the flow. And so Milkman ends up poking around like his family heritage more and discovering that there is very likely in Virginia, which is where the family was originally from, some missing gold that he believes that the family has, and that was hidden and by his aunt Hagar, and that he needs to go and get it. So he journeys down to Virginia to find this, and so it becomes this whole ordeal, and him and Guitar end up having a falling out. So what kind of goes from there. I enjoyed this overall. I thought it did get a little bit slow, maybe in like the middle, and I was reading over the period of several days, and then like all of a sudden I picked up and I finished like half of it within a day. This was her third novel she wrote. It was after The Bluest Eye and Sula, and I think that you can see a maturity in the writing, and that her writing is much more dense in this book in comparison to her other two books. And there is also within this story a magical realism element to Milkman's family history that is sort of like uncovered in this book. Yeah, I mean, I think it was very well written. I thought it was a really interesting piece of life. I mean, Toni Morrison has always been really good at writing these very complex family histories that are also very much situated to like the material conditions of the time and place of African Americans within the early to mid 20th century. I think that I am maybe a little more preferential to Sula, though, only because that is focused primarily on a story focused on women and female friendship, and so that's just naturally something I gravitate towards. But this book I thought it was very compelling, and the ending completely catches you off guard, but not in like an undeserved way, in a good way. So yes, I would recommend, and I rated it 4 stars. The next book I read was Black Dog, White Cat by Kelly Link, which is a collection of short stories. This contains 7 short stories that are all loosely based on rather obscure European fairy tales, save for Hansel and Gretel. And so at the start of each chapter, the original fairy tale title is listed, and then it's accompanied with a drawing. So like more short story collections, this was a mixed bag for me. I do think that Kelly Link is a good writer, and I think that she is good at telling these fairy tales, upgrading them to a contemporary setting, mixed in with a little bit of dystopia. But I have to say that the only 2 that I like really genuinely liked were The Girl Who Did Not Know Fear and Skinder's Veil. In the first story, The Girl Who Did Not Know Fear, we follow a woman who is repeatedly stuck at this hotel airport, and her flight keeps being delayed. It keeps getting pushed back, and so she just ends up staying there for like a week, and she's like spending all this time swimming in the pool where she has some unsettling visions. And then in the second, Skinder's Veil, a young man goes to house sit a cottage in Vermont under this weird stipulation from the owner that guests can only enter in through the kitchen door, and that the house's owner will come there to visit, but he cannot enter at all. In some of these stories, what I thought was interesting was that time is presented as this Mobius strip, which was something I liked because it isn't something I think that is often explored in literature. And it did make me think a little bit of David Lynch, because that is something that he has done in his works. At least he did in Mulholland Drive. I mean, there were other stories in this that I thought were decent. The White Cat's Divorce, The Lady and the Fox. I think the ones that didn't work for me were some of like the dystopian ones, because it just sort of felt like you were plopped into this world and you didn't understand like what the rules of it were, the whole world building. It was just like, okay, I don't know what's going on. Like, they were kind of Black Mirror-esque, but not really in a way that I liked. So if you like magical realism or Black Mirror or even David Lynch, I would say check this collection out. You know, I thought it was decent, but I just wish that there was like more stories other than the two that I would have liked more. So I gave it 3.5 stars. The next book I finished in January was My Friends by Hisham Matar. This was a galley, an ARC that I found in a little lending library. I was not a fan of this book. I mentioned this in my unhaul video. This was such a disappointment for me. I've read Hisham Matar before. I read a memoir of his called The Return. And this just wasn't really it. So this young man, he lives in Libya and he goes to study abroad in England in the 1980s. While he's there, he meets another Libyan man who's also in the same kind of situation as him, named Mustafa. And one day, the protagonist and Mustafa, they go to this demonstration at the Libyan embassy in England against the Gaddafi regime, because the Gaddafi regime murdered some student protesters. And so they protest in front of the embassy, and now this is based on true events. There are shots that break out from the embassy from the Libyans, and so at least like 11 Libyans were injured, and then there was a British policewoman who was killed. And so Khalid, that was his name. Khalid is one of the main character. He's one of the Libyans who is injured. So is Mustafa. And so that changes the course of his life forever, because he cannot tell his parents back in Libya that he was at this protest because they live under the Gaddafi regime. So the phone lines are tapped. The mail is screened. And if he admits that, he will be putting his life in danger. He's never going to be able to return. And he also will be putting his parents' life in danger that he was at this anti-Gaddafi protest. So he has to then essentially stay in England and slowly sever contact with his parents. That's what he decides to do. Now, the book is titled My Friends because there are some friends that are central to Khalid's life as he is living in England and comes to be a permanent citizen. The aforementioned Mustafa, who was also injured at the protest, and then this writer who was a political dissident of the regime, Hisham. I just sort of felt that for a book titled My Friends, I had very little sense of the friends in this book. Like, one is hot-tempered and impulsive, and then the other is moody and brooding, and everyone is just endlessly searching for something outside themselves because they're longing for their home country. And, you know, I have read so many stories about the politics of diaspora and exile, and it just sort of felt very bland and generic and didn't offer anything new. What gets more and more unbelievable towards the end is we do end up skipping ahead in time throughout the 80s up until 2011. And if you're not familiar with the history of 2011, like I said, that was the Arab Spring. That was when Gaddafi was overthrown. There was an uprising, I believe, in eastern Libya. And so Mustafa and Hisham, spoiler alert on this, they end up going to Libya and joining militias. And Mustafa ends up becoming a famous militia fighter. This is a man who has lived for the past 25 years in England as a white-collar worker. We were not even aware that he knew how to shoot a gun. And you mean to tell me he went back to Libya and is now this famous, revered militia fighter? And then Hisham joins him. And Hisham also becomes a famous militia fighter. And oh my goodness, they end up becoming part of the brigade that captures and kills Gaddafi. I mean, it just felt so ridiculous. Like, Hisham Matar was literally just inserting his characters into like every central Libyan event, significant Libyan event that had happened within the past decade. Like, it was unbelievable. And I think the thing that bothered me was, first of all, okay, let me just say a side note. His time in England, he adjusts rather swimmingly, right? There was no mention of being a Libyan immigrant in England, in Thatcher's England, okay? And the racism and Islamophobia that you would face is just a great place. Nothing. There's a little bit mention of a scuffle at the border when he's like traveling in Spain, but that's it. It's just a peachy keen place. Okay. The way he leaves out a crucial part of the overthrow of Gaddafi that is completely ahistorical. And this kind of drove me nuts. And I think this is kind of ties into the way he portrays England because it's completely sanitized. NATO was involved in the removal of Gaddafi. And that was a very controversial decision. Barack Obama bypassed Congress. He now says it was the worst mistake of his presidency. It very likely prolonged the civil war. It left a giant power vacuum within Libya where then various militia groups were fighting each other with all these provided weapons. And then NATO was like, hey, see you guys. Good luck. And it set a dangerous precedent on the world stage as to, hey, leaders, if you make peace with the West, like Gaddafi did, peace with the West, we're still going to overthrow you, so don't give up your nuclear weapons. I mean, I think in a perfect world that the Libyans alone would have overthrown Gaddafi, but that is not the world we live in. It's just not, because the global south can't move an inch without the global north breathing down its neck. So, yeah, it is a little weird, but not surprising that he chose to completely omit that. And I think it might tie back to his very sanitized view of living in Thatcher's England. So, yeah, I think just for me, that weird sanitized account, the ridiculousness of it, it just didn't work for me. It just felt very blah. And yeah, I rated it 2.5 stars. And then the last and final book I read in January was Blood Feast by Malika Moustadraf, translated by Alice Guthrie from Arabic. This was originally published in Morocco, and it was a collection of her short stories that were published posthumously. This is a very slim novel. It was published, I think, by Feminist Press. And the stories in this book are very stark, abrupt, and full of rage. It offers a really fascinating glimpse of Morocco and the lies, I want to say around Casablanca, which is where the author was from, the domestic lives of women and daughters, the chronically ill, which plays a big part in this book, trans sex workers, and terrible men. The writing style is very abrupt, and the subject matter of all of these short stories is really bleak. I think that a lot of the stories, I mean, the rage is palatable, but some of them did feel a little incomplete. They end, like I said, rather abruptly, or they're just not like fully fleshed out. She kind of oscillates between like women's voices, women's point of view, but then also sometimes men's point of view. So we're like in the head of sometimes terrible men. as was the case of Noor Naga's book. So I did feel at times, sometimes the characters' voices started to blur together. The standout story for me in this, which was the last story, it was called Death. It is, again, it's just really about like domestic life, but it's primarily about this conversation of a young girl, and I think like her parents, and she's doing her homework at the dinner table, and she's like, oh, I hate history, I have trouble with it, and the dad is like, oh, history is easy, it's just the same lessons repeating themselves over and over again. I was like, that's a good line. And in the meantime, this conversation, they have like the news on, and it's interwoven with active news stories going on of Israeli aggression in Lebanon and in Palestine, and roughly, I could tell, like circa 2006. And so the way that was juxtaposed with the conversation, it was really eerie, I thought. And that to me, like I said, was a standout story. I did learn, I think, a little bit about the Moroccan healthcare system, and I had no idea it was so poor. It is partially privatized. I don't know if it is to the extent of our system here in the US. But there's an author's note in the back, which I think is also just worth the read alone. And it's a really interesting glimpse into her life. She suffered from chronic kidney disease, and she lacked access to treatment. Because of her short stories, too, the subject matter she wrote about, she was very much shunned by the Moroccan elite of her time in the 2000s. And now it's only after her death that she is really revered and respected as a well-known feminist author. And she tragically died of kidney disease at the age of 37. So, yeah, I think that it's memorable. Like, it's just a shame that we don't have more of her work, because like I said, some of these stories just felt incomplete. But yeah, I would rate it like 3.5 stars. And yeah, that's it. That is a wrap up of the 9 books I read in the month of January. Please let me know if you have read any of these books, or if you want to read these books or books that are similar that you would recommend. And I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.